Kentucky's got another huge non-conference matchup tomorrow, and it's looking like both teams could provide each other some serious matchup issues.
You are Locked On Kentucky, your daily podcast on the Kentucky Wildcats, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, what's going on, Big Blue Nation? Welcome on into Locked On Kentucky, your daily Kentucky Wildcats podcast. I'm your host, Lance Dawe, and on today's episode of Locked On Kentucky, we are going to be previewing Kentucky basketball taking on the Gonzaga Bulldogs, a big-time matchup in Seattle. Going to be talking with our friend Andy Patton, host of the Locked On Zags podcast, breaking this one down. A lot of fascinating matchup problems, I think, for both of these teams. We'll dive into it in just a second. So let's go ahead and do it without further ado. Here is our conversation with Andy Patton.
What's up, folks? Welcome into the Locked On Zags and Locked On Kentucky podcasts. It is a crossover episode here as we get ready for the epic game between Gonzaga and Kentucky on Saturday. We are your hosts for today. I am Andy Patton. He is Lance Dawe of Locked On Kentucky. Today's episode is brought to you, folks, by Game Time. Folks, download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you will get $20 off your first purchase. All right, it's a crossover episode, like we said, so I'm going to ask Lance some questions about Kentucky, about their game against Clemson, how they've done so far in the Mark Pope era. Lance has got some questions for me after that, and then we're going to make some predictions for this game, talk about the season overall, how we think these two teams are going to finish when March rolls around. Lance, great to have you on. Excited for number 3 in this 6-year series between these two programs.
Yeah, this is going to be a big one for the Wildcats, trying to kind of change what has happened against the Bulldogs over the last couple of seasons, where they have just gotten absolutely dominated on defense. You hopefully don't see the same things in this game. I'm fearful you may see some of them, as we'll get into. But yeah, this is a big time game for Kentucky to see how they respond after losing to Clemson. And it's a big time game for Gonzaga to add another really strong win to their already pretty impressive resume to me, just based on what I've seen so far from them. So yeah, it should be a fun one in Seattle.
Should be a really good one. And you mentioned the Clemson game, and I think that's where I want to start, because that was the first real, Kentucky struggled in the first half against Duke, but they came back. They kind of, I mean, it was great coaching by Mark Pope and great playing, but it was a lot of just kind of out-experiencing that Duke team that was very young, and they kind of were able to outlast them with so much veteran experience. But they lose this game to Clemson, who's a very good team, who should have been in the top 25 last week, who, assuming they take care of Miami this weekend, will be in the top 25 next week. But Clemson is a good team with a lot of veteran experience. They're a well-coached team. It's a true road environment. A lot of things that, outside of the true road environment aspect, a lot of things that are going to be similar in this game against Gonzaga. You're playing in a likely hostile environment. You're playing against a team that's got a lot of experience. You're playing against a coach who's been very successful in Mark Few. And I think the player that really stood out in that game was Ian Shefflin, who he was an absolute monster on the block in that game. He didn't shoot it all that well, but he had 20 plus rebounds. He's had like 13 or more rebounds in his last 5 games. He's playing some great ball. And what it really kind of showed to me, at least, was that there is an area to kind of exploit Kentucky with regards to physicality in the front court. And Amari Williams has been fantastic. I don't want to take anything away from him. He's the number 1 rated defensive player, according to evanmedia.com, in the country. And I think eye test certainly backs that up. He's a phenomenal player, but he only plays about 20 minutes a night. And I think for Gonzaga, being able to potentially kind of try to pick on some of those bigs who aren't as physical for Kentucky, the Brandon Garrisons, the Andrew Carrs of the world, it feels like an area where Gonzaga could potentially create some mismatches. What did you see in the Clemson game that either worried you for Kentucky, or even some things that you maybe think, hey, that's going to be a positive learning experience for this team going forward?
I think the thing that worries me the most is the inability to be more physical on the glass. Heading into this game, Kentucky was the best defensive rebounding team in the country, and a lot of that had to do with what Amari Williams was doing down low. And then defensively, like you mentioned, Evan Mia has him rated as the best defensive player individually in the country. And while you did see Williams play well against Shefflin in terms of efficiency, you did not see Kentucky as a whole do a great job of preventing him from getting offensive rebounds. He had 8 in that game. He had 20 total. He was 4 of 20 from the floor, but it was clear that he was the most important piece for the Tigers down there because he was giving them so many second chance opportunities. And it is the question, I think, heading into this game is, okay, Kentucky adjusted against Duke. They became more physical and they executed against a team that did not have the experience to get them through that game. You faced a team that was more physical, arguably, in my opinion, in a more hostile environment. And you were not able to out-physical them and out-adjust because of the fact that they had all of this momentum and they had this individual down low. So I think that the biggest thing that concerns me is, what does Kentucky do against Gonzaga's length, and how are they able to kind of hopefully change things up as far as going after rebounds, as far as adjustments with Garrison and Carr? Do you send more help? Because something that has really intrigued me about this Kentucky team is that they don't switch a ton unless they are forced to, and they really don't send a lot of help defense. It was something actually through the first few games of the season against bad opponents where it's just like, even the commentators were mentioning, man, Kentucky does not help. They will put guys in isolation situations and just expect them to execute. And you can't do that, I don't think, against Gonzaga, because they have a plethora of different guys that can go and finish very well at the rim. Most notably, Graham Ike, I believe that's how you pronounce his name, who has been really solid center transfer from Wyoming. But that's the big concern for me. It's, can Kentucky handle things down low pretty much in all aspects of the game? And so that's probably the biggest thing for me. If I had to give a positive here, though, Andy, that I kind of feel better coming out of that game, is that's probably the worst shooting performance that I can envision Kentucky having on the road. Shooting 26% from 3. They had a lot of really open looks. They just didn't hit them. If you hit 2, you win that game. So that's just kind of where I'm at. Is like, look, you played a really bad game on a road in a hostile environment where the whistle was not going your way. I would throughout the entirety of the game, but this one I hope to be different because of those reasons.
Yeah, there's a little bit of home cooking. There typically is in environments like that. You mentioned Graham Ike. One thing that really stands out to me, Gonzaga's played Mark Pope a lot, and we'll get to that from his time at BYU. But I remember that he doesn't do a lot of double teaming. But Graham Ike has not handled double teams well, and presumably Pope and everybody on that staff has watched some tape, and they'll see that, and that makes me wonder if they will. I think they'll probably feel pretty good about Williams on Ike one-on-one. Ike has struggled a bit to finish through physicality. He hasn't seen a ton of it, and when he has, it's every big struggles a little bit more with those kinds of guys. So, but I am curious if Carr or Garrison or Almanor is on him, if they're going to let him go one-on-one, because Gonzaga's going to take that 9 times out of 10 with Braden Huff, their backup big as well. But I did want to talk about Mark Pope specifically because he was at BYU for a long time. Him and Mark Few faced each other when they were both members of the WCC. Mark Pope is one of the most successful coaches at winning in Spokane against Gonzaga. He won there a few times. He's not going to be afraid of this environment. He knows what he's getting into in this matchup. And specifically, you and I spoke right after Mark Pope was hired on the Locked On College Basketball show about kind of the pulse, the fan base, how they were feeling. And then we spoke a few months later when that roster came together and Mark Pope had kind of endeared himself to Big Blue Nation. Now, I know that right now we're still coming off of that loss to Clemson, so maybe some of that goodwill has dipped a bit, but I have to imagine that folks are generally pretty darn happy with the early returns from the Mark Pope era in Lexington.
Yeah, I don't think that you could have asked for much better, considering the circumstances. You had a completely new roster put together with a bunch of kids that most of them didn't know each other existed last semester, and they're playing together, and they've already scored over 100 points 4 times. Like, the proof of concept is absolutely there. The offense works. The team seems to really like each other and play with a lot of heart. I absolutely love that. That's what got them through their Duke win. And if I had told the Kentucky fan base, look, you're going to split Duke and Clemson 1-1, and you're going to start 7-1, I don't think they would have complained. And I really don't think they would have complained if they knew that we were going to beat Duke for the first time in 9 years. So it's the vibes are still very, very high in Lexington. You don't want to get blown out this weekend. I'll say that for sure. But the Wildcats, I mean, given what he had to work with, this is about as good as you could have possibly asked for. And for me personally, because I'm a big analytics guy, The numbers say that Kentucky is significantly improved compared to last year, just starting off hot. So, and they're better than Arkansas, I'll say that. So I really, really do like where Kentucky's at right now underneath Pope. I've been thoroughly impressed with his coaching ability and then what he's done off the court as well.
We're going to flip the script. Lance is going to ask me some questions about Gonzaga, their quest to win a third straight game over the Wildcats. All that coming up in just a second. But first, folks, I love a great deal as much as the next guy, but I'm not going to go to great lengths just to save a few bucks. It has to be easy and no big hoops to jump through. So when Mint Mobile said it was easy to get wireless for $15 a month with the purchase of a 3-month plan, I called them on it. And it turns out it really is easy. The longest part of the process was the time I spent on hold waiting to break up with my old provider. All plans come with a high-speed data and unlimited talk and text delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. And you can use your own phone with any Mint Mobile plan and bring your phone number along with all of your existing contacts. To get this new customer offer and your new 3-month premium wireless plan for just $15 a month, go to mintmobile.com/lockedoncollege. That's mintmobile.com/lockedoncollege. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month with mintmobile.com/lockedoncollege. It's a $45 upfront payment required. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Speeds are slower above 40 gigs on the unlimited plan. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details.
All right, continuing along here on this crossover edition of Locked On Gonzaga and Locked On Kentucky, almost said Locked On. It's going to be breaking down this Kentucky versus Gonzaga game here. And Andy, I want to start with kind of what I mentioned at the top as far as Gonzaga and their strength of schedule. You have already played five different games against KenPom teams inside the top 100. You've won 4 of those games. You've beaten Baylor, Arizona State, San Diego State, and Indiana. And the offense has been clicking in every single one of those games. Kind of take me through how Gonzaga's been operating in those contests and what you've seen specifically from the offense.
Yeah, I think, coming into the year, we kind of knew that this is a team that retained 7 of their 8 players from last year's rotation. They lost Anton Watson, which was a significant loss, primarily on the defensive end of the floor, although he blossomed into a strong offensive player as well. But to keep the other 7 players together, I think, is a huge testament to this particular group of players' desire to play together, to win together, to stay in Spokane. I'm sure Gonzaga's NIL is pretty good, but to keep all those guys together is certainly a testament to their character and things of that nature. And then you go out and get a player like Caleb Battle, who is so prolific, particularly in those last 7 games of the SEC season last year with Arkansas. You go get a guy in Michael Ajayi, who led the conference, the WCC, in scoring and rebounding last year. To add those 2 guys to this mix has been what we thought we would see, a prolific offensive team that can beat you multiple different ways. If it's not Graham Ike on the block, it's Braden Huff coming in and Braden Huff's led Gonzaga in scoring multiple times, and he plays like 20 minutes a night off the bench. Or it's Caleb Battle going crazy, hitting like 5 threes in like a 4-minute span. When he's hot, he is the hardest player in the entire country to defend. I'll stand by that. He just also disappears for large chunks of games, which is something we're hoping to see consistency change a little bit going forward. And then there's Ryan Nembhard, who is the best point guard in college basketball. I will stand heartily by that. The way he has played this season, his assist turnover ratio is staggering. He is really good at taking care of the ball. He's not a prolific scorer, but he doesn't need to be for this team. I think we've seen a Gonzaga offense that can beat you so many different ways, whether it's on the block, outside. They have sharpshooters like Nolan Hickman. They have more bench depth than they've had in the past. It's a really prolific offensive team. And I think I've been almost as impressed with what they've done defensively as well. They started the season like in the 40s or 50s at KenPom in adjusted defensive efficiency. They've climbed all the way up to 18 at this point. They struggle with bigger guards is an area that I have a little bit of concern with. Ryan Nembhard is 6 foot generously, and Nolan Hickman's 6'2". So that's been an area that that's Arizona State. That game was closer than we thought because they were kind of able to exploit those guards. We saw that with West Virginia as well. Javon Small and Tucker DeVries are both bigger guards who were able to kind of use that to their unfair advantage. But this team is firing on all cylinders right now. I think the wins over San Diego State and Arizona State are going to continue to age well. Hopefully Gonzaga's win over Indiana will age well. We'll see about that team. I'm a little skeptical. Baylor is going to be Baylor. They're going to be fine. Not a concern there. So Gonzaga's put themselves in a position, especially with these upcoming games against Kentucky and then UConn and then UCLA. I mean, they're going to have a really strong strength of schedule heading into conference play.
So they've played really, really well, obviously, to start this season, especially in offense, like you mentioned, the defense just rising. Kentucky's actually in a similar spot where they were like, I want to say in the 60s or 50s in adjusted defensive efficiency. They've climbed all the way up to number 23, which has been such a breath of fresh air compared to where Kentucky was defensively a season ago. But both these teams have the one loss at 7-1, Kentucky to Clemson. And then I watched a good portion of the end of this game. I did not get to see all of it, so I need to kind of a breakdown of what happened here. The 86-78 loss to West Virginia in overtime in the Bad Boy Movers Invitational. At least I believe that's where it was located. But what exactly happened in that West Virginia game that kind of caused it to be competitive and then forced it into OT?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of factors. I think it's an early season game against a team that up to that point, the only real opponent they had played was Pitt, and they got beat very badly by Pitt. And so that was a bit of a surprise. And I just think that, I think Gonzaga didn't have a great idea of what this West Virginia team was. I mean, I think they're still figuring it out themselves. And Darian DeVries is a very, very good coach. And Gonzaga, they looked a little flat. They came out a little flat. The energy wasn't really there. It was the first game in Atlantis in the tournament. And I think they just weren't quite ready for what they were getting into. We've seen Graham Ike have kind of some off nights already this season. And I think there's probably a little bit more concern than there needs to be about Graham Ike. He's going to be just fine, but he wasn't super prepared for this one. And then I think Javon Small and Tucker DeVries are both phenomenal guards. They're good shooters. DeVries is a fantastic 6'7", really big-bodied guard who can really shoot it, and just the kind of matchup that is really challenging for Gonzaga. It's what worries me a little bit about Otega Oweh and Kobe Brea to a lesser extent. Brea is not as doesn't do as much with the ball in his hands, but
right.
I think DeVries really caused problems, and Gonzaga should have won this game. I mean, even with West Virginia hanging with them and shooting well, the end of the game, Gonzaga just didn't execute down the stretch. I think they weren't really prepared to be in a close game. Made some mistakes at the end, but a lot of this was West Virginia having the kind of game that you need to have to beat a team like this. I mean, they came in, they were hot shooting. Sincere Harris is a phenomenal defensive guard, and he was just all over Hickman and Nembhard this entire game with his physicality, kind of pushing him around a little bit. And I just think that once this thing got into OT, it just felt like Gonzaga's momentum was really sapped from them. And I think they deserve a lot of credit for responding the way that they did. I said it already. I don't think Indiana's very good, but they still went out and beat that team pretty handily the next day, which is not easy to do, and then picked up a nice win over a Davidson team that I think is pretty good as well. Not quite as good, certainly, but on that level. And yeah, I think West Virginia is just a good team, and I think they're a better team than a lot of people expected they would be, which makes sense when it's a team that had a new coach and a whole new roster. You don't really know what you're getting into. It's kind of similar with a team in your conference in Vanderbilt who's been pretty good too. And it's like, well, we didn't really know what they were going to look like with so many new faces. But that game and the Arizona State game in particular kind of showed that Gonzaga is definitely not bulletproof. They struggle to rotate on defensive switches. And this is something that Mark Pope has exploited against Gonzaga in the past. And so that's a concern for me of this team is really, really good at shooting the basketball. And if Gonzaga is a step slow rotating defensively and Kobe Brea is open for three, well, he's knocked him down 60% of the time. And if he's open, I bet it's a lot higher than that. So that's something that I think West Virginia did show and Arizona State showed can be an area that Gonzaga struggles, particularly on defense.
So both these teams obviously are human. That's what I was going to say. It's like the biggest thing for me is that both of these teams have shown coming in, yes, they have very high ceilings, but they also have different things that they struggle with, which is what makes it such an interesting matchup to me, because normally I would sit here in this spot and go, okay, Kentucky at the rim is questionable. Gonzaga very good at the rim. game over, like you lose. But with the way that I've seen Kentucky adjust in a big time game already, and the way that I've seen Gonzaga just kind of go out and handle some of these really strong teams, and like you mentioned, Baylor, Arizona State, San Diego State, it makes it really competitive for me. And I think it's going to be a fun game Saturday. The final question I'll ask to you, and this is something just because I simply haven't watched enough Gonzaga, and to have somebody that has, I want to ask this question. So Braden Huff is on KenPom. One of the most utilized players on this roster. He does not start despite looking by the numbers. And if you look at last year, this stays true, is somebody that can stretch out to the 3-point line and knock it down for his size. Why doesn't Braden Huff start for Gonzaga?
Yeah, it's a question a lot of the fan base is asking as well.
Okay.
So I think a primary reason is that Graham Ike, I don't think Mark Few wants to bench Graham Ike, and I don't think he views those two guys as playing together being a super viable option, certainly not a starting option. I think a lot of it is wanting to have an option. Graham Ike gets in foul trouble at an elite level. He is incredible at getting in foul trouble, and that worries me in this game as well. I think Graham Ike, when he gets his first foul, it seems like it's a lock that he's going to get his second foul like 40 seconds later. I don't know why that is always the case with him, but Mark Few is very diligent about 2 fouls and you're out. And so Braden Huff ends up playing a lot of minutes in the first half of games because Graham sits for the final 12 minutes or 15 minutes or whatever of the first half. And you mentioned the usage rate. Gonzaga loves to funnel the ball to the bigs. The paint touches has always been Mark Few's thing for as long as Mark Few's been the head coach there. That's what they do. And I think they really ratchet it up when Braden gets the ball because he's like 75% around the rim. He was last year as a freshman. He is this year as a sophomore. At one point, he was like 85%. Like if he gets the ball on the block, he can go over his right shoulder with his left hand, and it's basically automatic. He's also, like you mentioned, can space the floor a little bit. And we've seen them, and they don't do this with Graham. They'll run like kind of short pick and roll actions because Nembhard can thread the needle. And last year when they ran pick and roll actions, teams would just go under and force Nembhard to shoot. This year they kind of run it from the free throw line, and it works, but it works really well with Huff because they don't do the pick. And if teams go under on that screen, Braden Huff is wide open from 3, and he's knocking them down at a high clip. Defensively, I think is another answer. Graham's a better defender than Braden Huff, and Braden is getting better in that area, but Graham is really good at hedging those screens, which is what Gonzaga loves to do. Braden's typically a bit slower on hedging those screens. He's not quite as physical down low. So I think matchup-wise, that is part of it, and it'll be interesting. I think, if Braden's in when either Garrison or Carr or Alman or whatever is playing the center spot, I think that is an advantage for Gonzaga, because not going to be as easy to exploit defensively as he might be with some of those other guys. But that is, if Mark Pope goes at Braden Huff defensively, that's going to make it hard to keep him on the floor, and that's going to be an advantage for Kentucky because he is a prolific offensive player.
In the words of Lethal Shooter, I understand it now. All right, sweet. Okay, so we've talked about Kentucky, we've talked about Gonzaga. Let's go ahead and give our predictions here in just a little bit on this crossover edition of Locked On Gonzaga and Locked On Kentucky. Before we do that, though, I want to tell you guys about our friends over at FanDuel. You can tackle the NFL action this season with FanDuel. It's America's #1 sportsbook because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if they win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL and any sport for that matter, and it's all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, maybe you get one during this contest this weekend between the Zags and the Wildcats, you can check out the latest stats, you can view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. It's a pretty sweet app. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's over at FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. All right, wrapping up this crossover edition of Locked On Gonzaga and Locked On Kentucky. So we've talked about both these teams. We've talked about how maybe these teams could have success and maybe some areas where they could struggle against each other. I'm just going to go ahead and get right to it, Andy. KenPom right now thinks Gonzaga is going to win this game by 6. Gives them a 71% chance to win this one. It's in Seattle. You've seen how Gonzaga has played well against Kentucky over these last 2 seasons, but you kind of have to throw all of that out the window heading into this one. Where are you sitting at that 6-point projection?
Yeah, that's one of those things of like, oh, it's the previous matchups just don't really matter, not just because the roster is completely overhauled, but more so because the coach is not there anymore. And I think, right. I mean, speaking candidly, it seemed like Mark Few was able to outcoach John Calipari in both of those games and come up with teams. I don't think that's a secret. I don't think there's a lot of people listening who would disagree with that. The second half of those games was very often significantly favored Gonzaga, whereas Mark Pope is tremendous at making halftime adjustments. We saw it against Duke. We even saw it against Clemson. It didn't lead to a victory, but it did help them kind of get back into that game and stay in that game. And I mentioned on my show on the Thursday episode that second half, the first 5 minutes of the second half feels critical in this game because Pope's going to do something different if Gonzaga's got a lead. And if Gonzaga loses that lead, it feels like it's going to be really hard for them to stay with it. Having said that, I made my game prediction before I saw what Ken Palm's was, and mine actually ended up pretty close. I have Gonzaga by 9, 84-75 is my prediction. I will say this. Gonzaga has played multiple times at the Climate Pledge Arena since it was rebranded. It used to be Key Arena. It's been Climate Pledge for a while. They have yet to win. They actually haven't won at that venue since 2015 when they beat Tennessee. They lost Alabama like 4 years ago. They lost to UConn last year. It's not like either of those are bad losses. Both those teams were great, but it is something Gonzaga fans are starting to get anxious. Like, we'd really like to win in Seattle. So I got them winning this one, but I wouldn't be surprised if it goes the other way. These are two of the top 5 teams, top 10 teams in the country, and I think we're going to see an electric game on Saturday.
That is interesting. I would have thought. I thought that's what you were about to say was the complete opposite. If they've already played here and they're comfortable, that's interesting.
They are comfortable there, but they haven't been winning. So
there you go. So I think the big thing for me, Andy, in this one, the thing to watch for Kentucky coming off a game where they shot less than 26% from three. Gonzaga right now is the third best 3-point defense in the nation, and they've already faced, if you want to go and look, 3 of the 5 best 3-point shooting teams they will face this year. They've already faced the elite competition on their schedule. Only team they haven't played is Oregon State, who shoots 38%. Kentucky shooting 36.8%, but as we know, they've had a couple of shooting slumps, I should say, in different games recently. But we know this team can absolutely shoot the lights out. But like, we know that was what this roster was put together to do. So that's really where this thing kind of starts and ends outside of, Amari Williams at the rim for me is, can Kentucky shoot well from three? And if they can absolutely go out there and win this game, regardless of whether or not they're having some inconsistencies there down low. Because that's kind of what, again, held them out of the game against Clemson, is that you could not shoot threes. If you shoot them at your average rate, you win that game, and you win that game by 8+, I think. So this game against Gonzaga, while I think a lot of people would be really nervous going into it about, what Kentucky's able to do at the rim, that essentially being what Gonzaga does, especially on offense. I really do think that a bounce-back game is in order for Kentucky. They got up against Duke. I think they're going to get up for this one. Like you mentioned, Mark Pope has seen Mark Few and this team, or this strategy that Gonzaga likes to implement quite a bit, given where he's from. So I think that Kentucky will find a way to win this game. I think they'll find a way to gut it out. I think it'll be extremely close if they end up doing so by like a 2 to 4 point margin, similar to what happened against Duke. But I have faith in the Cats. I didn't pick Kentucky to beat Duke. A lot of the people that watch my show weren't too happy about that. So I'm going to take the Wildcats to win here. And I really do believe that they've got a shot in this one. It's just about going out and execute.
Yeah, I think the 3-point shooting is so critical for Kentucky and the defense for Gonzaga too. And I know that data on Gonzaga. I know that their 3-point defense has been phenomenal this year, and it's been so far improved from what they have. It's been an area of struggle for Gonzaga for a long time, really since that 2017 team, which was so incredibly elite defensively and went to that championship game. And then again in 2021, when they went to the championship game against Baylor, those two teams were phenomenal defensively. And then the year after that, they had Chet Holmgren, and he erased so many mistakes for Gonzaga's defense. But really, perimeter defense hasn't always been a strength, and it's been great to see it be so prominent this year. I think there are some things that have worked in their favor. Baylor didn't have Langston Love. He's one of their best 3-point shooters in that game. And we saw other teams that I think are good 3-point shooting teams that just didn't shoot it very well. Arizona State missed a ton of open threes that I don't think they'll miss very often. But that is what worries me a little bit is like, I watched Otega Owe miss a bunch of threes against Clemson that I was like, wow, he was wide open. And then I looked at his numbers and I'm like, he's shooting 39% on the year. Like he doesn't normally miss those. And if he doesn't miss those against Gonzaga, that's going to make things a lot more difficult for the Zags. And I have so many memories of Mark Pope, BYU teams being so good at getting up and down the floor. Obviously their tempo is phenomenal. One of the top in the country. I think it's 6th right now at Ken Pom. And teams rarely try to outrun Gonzaga. One of the only teams I can remember trying to outrun Gonzaga and succeeding was BYU and Mark Pope. And I think he's got the athletes to do it this year. And I think if Gonzaga is struggling, not only getting back, but not getting back and finding shooters. Like if Kobe Bryant can sneak into the corner on a fast break and Gonzaga's not getting back and finding him, that's going to lead to a loss. Like those are the kind of things that Mark Pope is very good at, and that's why he concerns me. There are obviously players that concern me on this Kentucky roster, but it's not even really the team as much as it's the coach and the fact that he basically got a blank check to build the roster that he wants to build based on his coaching style, which when he didn't have that kind of resources, he was still able to beat Gonzaga. That alone is enough of a reason to, and I apologize to the Gonzaga fans who already weren't going to sleep, but that's enough reason to be anxious about this game right there. But if Gonzaga does what Gonzaga can do, they can win this one. But Mark Pope has found this recipe before, and he's got a lot of pieces that are going to be good to use against the Zags in this one.
And oh, by the way, you play UConn a week after that.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's a fun start to the season, I think, for both these programs. Mm-hmm. I'm really interested to see what happens in this one, Andy. So you believe they will win by 9. I'll take Kentucky by 3. I said 2 to 4. I'll sit right there in the middle. Coming out of this game, man, if either of these teams win, for us, for Kentucky, it's another reason to believe that you can compete for a national title, especially seeing what happened between Duke and Auburn. You have now beaten a team that has beaten Auburn, and Auburn looks like they were unstoppable heading into that game against Cameron Indoor. Of course, it's Cameron Indoor. You know what's going to happen in there. But Kentucky winning this game would just further solidify that. For Gonzaga, how would fans feel coming out of this one if they were able to get the victory?
Yeah, I think the fan base is a little bit concerned about Gonzaga's strength of schedule, which frankly I find a little silly. And I kind of said that on my show. Baylor has, they lost that game to UConn, which was an unranked loss, which is kind of funny. But Baylor's gonna be fine. I'm not worried about them. Indiana doesn't look as good. Sure. UConn, I think people were worried about, but they're going to be fine too. But ultimately, I think people have started to put a little bit more pressure on this Kentucky game in particular. Of like, this feels like a game we need to win. Coming out of non-conference with 2 losses, even if you turn around and beat UConn and UCLA, I think we'll have people concerned. And it's like a very deeply ingrained concern that Gonzaga fans have, simply because we know that our strength of schedule takes a dip when we get into conference play, even though St. Mary's is consistently a top 20 team at Ken Pom, even though San Francisco and traditionally Santa Clara, although they're down this year, they did just stomp TCU a few days ago. But those teams, they're certainly not the same as the SEC, which is just unbelievably loaded. I was going to say at the top, but really just all the way down to the bottom. That conference is stacked this season. But for Gonzaga, I think there is some fear that there's not as many opportunities to pick up major wins, and that this is a potentially huge one sitting there for them. But that's not as big of a concern for me. I think a close loss here is not the end of the world for Gonzaga, especially if they can take something from it and learn something from it. But a win, keeps you in the top 5 conversation where they belong. I know they dropped out of the top 5 after the West Virginia loss, but they belong to be in the top 5. Kentucky, if they win, they'll stay in the top 5. I think even with the loss to Clemson, especially with Marquette losing and Kansas losing and everybody else. So to me, part of this game is who's going to stay in the top 5. And the loser, are they still going to stay in the top 10? If it's Kentucky, they'll have lost 2 in a row. Probably not. But can they get back in that conversation? And I think both these teams feel like Elite 8 teams to me. That doesn't necessarily mean I think they'll both be in the Elite 8, but both are very clearly talented enough to be there. I wouldn't be surprised if they both are. I wouldn't be surprised if 1 or 2 of them's in the Final Four either. Like, these teams are really well built. They're talented. They're experienced. I mean, you mentioned this Kentucky team; these guys didn't know each other. But how many of these guys played 4, 5, 6 years of college basketball? And Gonzaga's got a lot of veteran guys too. So it's a fun matchup between 2 really good teams, and I think both are in good enough spots where a loss is not killer for them, which is what you want. But yeah, I know the Gonzaga fan base wants to win this one more than anything, and I'm pretty darn sure BBN, especially after a loss to Clemson, is feeling the same.
I think it will be a high-stakes competitive environment with probably one of the better games we're going to see this year, frankly, in college basketball. Andy, thank you so much for hopping on. This has been super fun. I always love hopping on and breaking down stuff with you, just because it feels like sometimes, man, at the Locked On Podcast Network, we don't have enough people that know ball. And I mean, enough people that don't know college basketball. It's fun to kind of talk about it every now and then.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on, Lance. This is a lot of fun. I love these crossover episodes, hoping to do more of them going forward. That's going to wrap it up for us today here on Locked On Zags and Locked On Kentucky. Folks, thanks for making the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Continue to check out both these shows going forward this season. We'll have a fantastic game on Saturday. As I said, to either Gonzaga fans or Lance, any of your listeners, I'm going to be at the game on Saturday. I'm going to be there in the house with my family. So come say hi. You'll see me wearing a Locked On shirt. Come say hi. Give me a Go Zags. Give me a Go Cats if you want. I won't be too offended by that. And looking forward to it. It's going to be a fun one. Thanks again, folks, for listening. And until next time, peace out.
All right, that was our conversation with Andy Patton, host of the Locked On Zags podcast. Really appreciate him sitting down and previewing this game, crossing over, talking ball. Love doing it. He also hosts the Locked On College Basketball podcast with Isaac Shade. Would highly encourage you to go check out both the Locked On College Basketball podcast and Locked On Zags, both on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast. All right, that is going to do it for today's episode of Locked On Kentucky. You can follow the show on Twitter at Locked On UK. You can follow me on Twitter at LanceDawe_, and you can follow the show over on Instagram. That is at Kentucky Podcast. Any questions, comments, concerns, leave those in the YouTube comments below. Hit me on the socials. I will see you all tomorrow for another episode of Locked On Kentucky. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and God bless.